Hello, everyone. This is James Shore with Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript. You're watching The Lab, which is where we explore, experiment, and generally mess about. And today in The Lab, we are continuing our series on Ember.js, the framework for creating ambitious web applications. It was originally created by Yehuda Katz. This is part 2 of our Ember.js series. In part 1, we looked at the basics, what it takes to get Ember up and running, how to create a hello world, things like modularity and testing. Now in part 2, we're going to look at design and architecture. We're going to take the sample application that we mocked up in the first part with some dummy data and actually get this live and working. This turned out to be way more work than I expected, so I've split it into a third part as well. In this episode, in part 2, we're going to look at the question of rendering and interacting with our domain layer and value objects. And then in part 3, next episode, we'll be looking at interactivity, cross-application communication, and some other issues that come up along the way. In today's episode, I have 5 chapters for you. First, we're going to review the challenge. Then we'll look at basic rendering and text. We'll continue on with advanced rendering, such as attributes and classes, and then move on to nested components, and particularly testing nested components. We'll wrap up with a look at our results so far. As usual, there's a lot of ground here, so go ahead and use the timestamps here to jump to sections of interest. And as always, the source code is available here at the link on your screen. Thanks for joining me, and welcome to the lab. Let's start out with a review of what we're doing here in this series. We're using an example application that I originally built in Java way back when for my Let's Play TDD screencast as a vehicle for really exploring Ember in depth and understanding what its limitations are. So what we're going to do here is we're going to rebuild this application here. It has a couple of notable things about it. The most notable is that we're using a value object pattern from Ward Cunningham's Checks pattern language, which is a fantastic pattern language, and I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't already. The value object pattern says that everything we see and do is immediately converted into objects. So this 10,000 string is immediately converted into a dollars object, or more accurately into a user entered dollars object. This here is a years object. This is another dollars object. We also have a tax rate object under the scenes. Everything in the application is represented via objects. And in my implementation of this pattern, I've actually made those objects immutable. One of the interesting things that this results in addition to being challenging for some frameworks, this also allows us to have some interesting behaviors. Another pattern in Ward's Checks pattern language is the idea of the exceptional value. This is a value that does not work. And in that pattern language, this is also converted into a value object that is operated on like any other object in the system. So all my domain layer knows how to do is add objects together, and this exceptional value object knows what to do when it's asked to add to something else. It creates another exceptional object. And that leads to this sort of neat spreadsheet-like display that we have here, where values, there's no error boxes popped up. We just see the values change and this error icon come and go. So what we're going to be doing in this episode is we're going to be implementing all of this, and especially some of the custom rendering logic that we have here. We're going to see how well Ember does with that. Now, our goal here is to investigate Ember deeply by building this application, and in particular, I want to look at 5 common pitfalls. We've talked about these before, so I'll just summarize them real quick. Our first one is lock-in. I want to know how hard it is to change to something else when Ember turns out to no longer be a good fit for me. It happens to every framework eventually. You want to move on. How hard is that going to be? Second is opinionated architecture. Does the framework make it easy to do what it wants, but very hard to do what I want? Accidental complexity. How much time do I spend working on the framework and making the framework work rather than working on my problems and making my application work? Poor testability. Can I do test-driven development doing small, focused unit tests that don't have a lot of mock objects? And lastly, server-side rendering. This is sort of a special case for front-end applications. It's important to render your initial page view on the server, so for two reasons. First, so that you get good search engine optimization, and second, so the users get good performance on that first page view. Those are 5 common pitfalls that we are going to be looking at. We're going to use this application to do it, and we have got it all mocked up here with just basic hard-coded data. What we did in the last episode was implement a bunch of templates that gave us these hard-coded values. Now what we're going to do in this episode is make these live, actually make everything hook up and ready to go. Now, something else that we did in the last episode is we got our automation working, we got modularity working so that, for example, we have an application file and a stock market row and a stock market test. These are all in separate files, which, as you probably know, JavaScript doesn't do that naturally. See the last episode for details about how that worked out. It wasn't as nice as I would have hoped, but we got it in the end. And we've got a really nice automated build that lints everything, compiles those templates into JavaScript, and then tests on all these browsers. I have got IE 11, Safari, Chrome, Firefox, and iOS going here. IE 8 is hooked up here, but it's actually not working. The tests actually fail, and that's not because Ember doesn't work on IE 8. As far as I know, it does. It's because the Mocha runner that we're using to get our Mocha test suite working, that doesn't work on IE 8. And unfortunately, the nature of Ember is it's very, very ridiculously opinionated about its tooling. If they don't provide a wrapper for your preferred test library, chances are good you're not going to be able to use it. And in this case, the library they've provided doesn't work on IE 8, so we're just out of luck on that point. That was the major conclusion I got from the first episode, by the way, is that Ember seems like a pretty solid library, well designed, but it is extremely opinionated about which tools it wants you to use. Not just architecture, we haven't really dug into that, but the tools. It wants you to use QUnit instead of Mocha, Testum scripts instead of Karma, Broccoli instead of Grunt, or Gulp or Jake, as I prefer. Just lots of things that it sort of sets up for you. And then if you diverge from that, your life becomes rather difficult. So that's where we're at. We have figured out all those issues. We do have Mocha working. We have Karma working, which is my preferred cross-browser runner. And we have Jake working and everything ready to go here. Now what I'd like to do is actually implement this. And the first thing to do is to get these cells in this stock market table actually rendering off of real data. Okay, let's get to it. As I said, what we want to do it for our very first step is to get this hard-coded value, all these hard-coded values, looking at real data. Now, over the break between episodes, I brought over all of our domain logic and persistence simulation and value objects from the original React review. This is just basically transpiled from Java unchanged, and part of the rules of these reviews is that I don't change this code. The goal is to see how well the framework can work with other people's code. That will tell us a little bit more about lock-in and opinionated architecture. So this is all ready to go. We have all of our value objects. Now what we need to do, though, is to get these cells to actually render these value objects. Now, the value objects have a very specific format that they render in. You actually ask them to render themselves, and this is kind of a quirky design decision that's not necessarily a good one, but it's one that we use, again, as a test of how the frameworks work with unusual decisions. So we tell the value object to render itself to a target, and then it turns around and calls a render method on that target. Again, kind of weird, not necessarily a good idea, but it will be a good chance for us to see how well Ember plays with this idea. So what we need to do is to somehow get our templates rendering using that format. And I think what I'd like to do, let me go ahead and just look at our stock market row. So right now we've got a stock market row component that doesn't really do anything and is linked to this stock market row handlebar template. So when we ask in our stock market table for a stock market row, Ember knows to look up this stock market row handlebars and stuff these values in. Now what we want to do is have each of these cells know how to render one of our renderable value objects. I think what I want to do is to break this down one step further and make a stock market cell handlebar template that we can then pass a value into. Now, it seems like we're going maybe a step too far with that, but I'm not sure if there's a better way. There's really not a lot of good documentation out there on Ember. Ember releases a new version every 6 weeks, and as a result, it's very, very hard. And those versions tend to change quite a lot. So it's really hard to find current recommendations online for how to architect an Ember application. So we're just going to have to wing it because the default documentation doesn't really say much about how to approach Ember, how to think in Ember, unfortunately. Let's just go ahead and see what we can do. What I'm going to do is create this new stock market row component. I'm going to pass in a value. Well, no, let's just do it like that for now. And I'll create a new handlebars file called stock market. Oh, stock market cell is what we want, actually. We already have a stock market row. And that's just going to be a TD high. Now, because we've included that in our stock market row, it should pop up now right here. There it is. Now the question is, how do we pass a value into that? Can we just say value equals by? So now what happens if we put in value here? If I understand this correctly, by passing this in here, we should have it now available in the context, basically on the controller. Will this work? Look at that. Look at that. It did work. Ha ha. Okay. Well, that's a good start. Now we have the ability to actually put things into this stock market cell. So this first one is going to be 2010, and then we'll have $10,000. I'm not going to try to do anything special just yet, but that means that our row can now pass in values. The reason that this matters is because remember, all of our values are actually objects, not strings. So we need to have the ability to pass in parameters into these cells that this cell can then do stuff with based on what the object tells it to do. So eventually we're going to turn this from a string to being actual variables that have objects in them. So we're just taking baby steps to get there. So if we rerun this, do we get everything? Well, not quite. I think what's happening here is, yeah, Ember by default wraps all of its components in a div. And in order to fix that, this is one of the things that we figured out last episode. In order to fix that, we have to make a controller, just like we did here, that has a tag name parameter. So this is exactly what we want to do. And again, the name sort of magically hooks it together. So we'll say stock market cell, and then we'll do basically exactly this, except that this is going to be a TD. Now that's not quite enough because this is a module. This is a CommonJS module, and CommonJS doesn't know to load it because we're not including it anywhere. So it's not loading up and it's not getting magically hooked in, and unfortunately there's no error messages. So what we have to do is go into our top level application, and this is clunky, and tell it that there's a stock market cell component, and it is this thing. Now I do not like this, but it's sort of the way that we were able to get this to work, and it's one of the clunky things about Ember right now because it's definitely built around its own special tooling. I think you could make it cleaner, but I don't want to. It's too much hassle. Okay, there we go. We have got things kind of working. But now what this has done, and this is something else I dislike about Ember, if we tell it that the tag name is TD, then what that means is that this TD is redundant. The TD goes outside whatever's in our template. So if we inspect these values, you'll see that actually there's a TD around a TD. So we don't need this TD. And that does raise the question, do we need the handlebars at all? Because we're just putting in a value here. I don't know. Maybe we don't. For now, though, I think it's easiest if we just keep this around. Okay, so now that we've done that, we should see that we no longer have our duplicate TD. Let me go ahead and restart that. There we go. Very good. Okay, now that we've got the basics figured out, let's start test driving this puppy. So I'm going to go ahead and create a test. Now, tests are a little bit weird. We have to use this special wrapper that is custom to each test library that we have. In this case, I found a test library that wraps Mocha, which is my preferred test framework right now. I'm not really a big fan of the way they've done this, but it is the way it is, so I'll just stick with it. So I'll make a stock market sell test and copy in this pattern. We're going to say that we're describing stock market sell. So we should be able to say the tag name is equal to TD and see that work. But it didn't. A helper named stock market sell could not be found. Great. Oh, this is the kind of stuff I hate about frameworks and their magic. Oh, it drives me crazy. I poked around a little bit into this, and I've discovered that if this stock market sell is my only running test, everything works fine. But if it's not, then it doesn't work. So clearly there's some sort of setup just not happening. I don't know what it is. Okay, that wasn't too bad. I think I got it. That was only 10 minutes of beating my head against the wall, not the hours I expected, although I may be speaking too soon. The error isn't occurring because I have two tests, thank goodness. The error is occurring in our stock market row, and our previously working stock market row test is now failing. And I think it's because we've added this stock market sell dependency inside of the stock market row. So we need to tell the stock market row test that it needs the stock market row. And I think we might need to put component in front. Let's see what happens without it though. Okay, it's still failing. Tried to normalize a container name without a colon in it. So we need to put the type in. So let's try it now. Oh, it's still failing. Helper name stock market sell cannot be found. Oh, well, this is not stock market row. It should be stock market sell. Fingers crossed, please work. I'm begging you. Ah. Oh, it did work. It did work. Our HTML changed, though, because now we're embedding another Ember component and it's putting all this crap in it. That's all right. We'll come back to that later. There we go. We have successfully asserted that our stock market row is a TR tag. Now, if we take out that only, we should be able to successfully assert that our stock market sell is a TD tag. Oh, look at that. Sweet, sweet victory. Oh, that was a close thing. This is documented, by the way, in the Ember documentation, so kudos to them. And luckily, Googling that error message actually brought me to an appropriate post that was helpful. So thank goodness. That's why I didn't spend as much time as I feared working on it, because there's no way I would have remembered this. It's been a little while since I recorded the last episode. I have read all of the documentation, but there's no way I would have remembered this little detail if Google hadn't pointed me in the right direction. Okay, now we need some way of setting this up with the appropriate value and seeing how it renders out. Now, how can we possibly do that when the setup is being done magically for us? Okay, looking at it, I think what we can do is just set the value parameter to whatever we want, and then it assert that it has what we want. So let's say that it renders, let's start out by just documenting this. So it renders a TD tag. That's our first test. And then we'll say it renders the value parameter. Now let's say that we expect the HTML, the inner HTML of this component to equal 10,000. Now, because we're not setting the value, it's either going to be blank or undefined or something. Let's see if that comes out. Yeah, it's blank. Look at that. Expected blank to equal 10,000. So that's a good sign. So now we should be able to just say component.set value to 10,000. And if I understand that, and I'm really not sure that I do, that should work. Okay. You've turned on testing mode, which disabled the run loops auto run. You need to wrap any code with asynchronous side effects in a run. Nice documentation. Kudos to the Ember folks. That is beautiful. I love it when a framework or a library tells me when I'm using it wrong and how to fix it. That's fantastic. And in fairness, it's in the documentation as well. So nicely done. Now it says it's asynchronous, but this is then returning immediately. I'm not sure what's going on there. Let's try it though. That worked. So I'm guessing that in testing mode, it's not actually asynchronous, but we still have to use ember.run for some reason. Yeah, it's really not clear to me what's going on here. We're getting into some of the deep magic of Ember, but it's working. So that's good. This is a really important fundamental thing here. We have now got the ability to pass in a value and see the result. And presumably, if we pass in a number, we will still see an answer come out. Yeah. And it came out as a string. So we see that the processing's happening there. So that's good. So we've got the basics in here. Now the next thing to do is to get our value objects actually hooked up. And now that we've got this, I don't think it's going to be that hard. Now that we've got this rendering a string, let's go ahead and try rendering an actual dollars object. So again, all of our values are value objects. In this case, the amount 10,000 is represented by a valid dollars. So we'll include that here. Then here I will instantiate it. Here we'll set it to value, and let's see what happens. I'm not necessarily expecting this to pass. I'm not sure. It does have a toString method on it that will render out with the $sign and the comma. But whether or not Ember actually calls that, I'm not so sure. It looks like it is. Just to be sure though, let's try changing this. Yeah, it's working great. So we do have this rendering to a string. Now just for fun, to prove that I know what's going on here, I'm going to try rendering a negative one. Now the code to do that is going to be the same in the UI. The decision about how to render negatives, specifically with a parenthesis around them, that's delegated to the value object. In fact, the whole point of this architecture is to allow the details to rendering to be handled by the UI, but information about how domain objects work and what they're supposed to look like in a UI agnostic way, that's actually delegated to the value object layer. But let's go ahead and do a -123 here, and then we should expect that to give us a 123 in parenthesis as our result. And that does appear to be working, but just to confirm, let's try changing the expected value. Yeah, that's working perfectly. Right now we've got the value object turning into a string. But actually what we need to do is we need to use the render method on the value object, the render_to method, because that is going to do more than just convert to a string. We also need to have negative values displayed in red, and we need to have invalid objects display with a little icon. So when something's invalid, it's supposed to have this little triangle icon in it. And when it's negative, it's supposed to be red. We can't do that with just a string rendition. So we need to support this render_to method. So let's refactor our stock market cell to support that. In our stock market cell, we're rendering out the value with curly braces. Let's see if we can get a negative attribute to show up. So let's try this. renders negative values with a negative CSS class. So again, we'll do this. And this code's in need of cleanup, but I'm just sort of exploring right now. So we'll expect this to equal that. That should work just fine with the code as it is, except we need a comma in there. That's actually an error in my test. Okay. And now I want to assert that we have a negative CSS class. So we should be able to say has class negative and expect that to be true. Now, right now that will be false, and it is. So how do we force Ember to put that class on there? I think we can just put it in as one of our properties here, but I don't remember which one. Okay, it looks like there's two things we can work with. First, there's class name bindings that will automatically convert variables on the controller or on the component into class names, or a class names property which will just be applied by default. So to start out with, I think we can just say class names negative and have that show up. It won't be programmatic. We need the class name bindings for that if I understand this correctly, but this should make our test pass. Yeah, there we go. So now what we need to do is make that not display a class when the value is positive. And that should fail, and it does. But now if I say class name bindings here, and then add a negative, this can take a function. Well, let's start out by just assigning this to true to make sure we understand how things work. That should cause the negative class to show up, because this means look at this property. Yeah. And if I turn this to false, it will look at this property, see that the property is false or is a Boolean and not true, and it will not add the negative class to the tag. So that should fail. And it does. Good. So now what I want to do is have this be a function that returns a value. To do that, we need to make a computed property, which I believe we do by saying property here, and then we need to tell it which property we're depending on, which in this case is value. It's kind of implicit, isn't it, that we've got this value dependency. Now inside here, we just need to say return true, and that should work the exact same way as just having a flat true on there, what did. Good. And false, again, should make the test fail. Good. And now, let's go ahead and bring this back in. So we're expecting false, but getting true. So now what I need to do is look at value. And I think the way I do that is by saying this.getValue, and that's going to be a value of valid dollars. And for now, rather than work with this render to, I'm just going to cheat and look at the amount, just for simplicity's sake in the short term. So we're getting the value, we'll look at the amount, and it's negative if the amount is less than 0. So that should now cause our test to pass. But it doesn't. So it's saying that the amount is null, or the object is null. That means this.getValue isn't working the way I think it is. Okay, I've manually modified the code to have a valid dollars when it runs in production, and the negative is showing up just fine. So that means that this null that we're getting back from this.get is some sort of test configuration issue. And I can't say I'm surprised about that, and I'm really not thrilled about it. I'm going to go bang my head against that wall and be back when it's fixed. Okay, I figured it out. It wasn't even that bad. What's happening is that when you call this $, it's rendering the component. But because that's before we set the value, that is resulting in this here being undefined. So that's actually reasonable behavior. And really what we need to do is set a default value here, I suppose. The other option would be to bring this $ down into each of our methods, and that might be a good approach as well. But I'm going to start out by just doing this. So if I do this, then that should cause this to work. Let me go ahead and wrap this in the run function. I'm still not sure what's going on with this run function because it's clearly not working asynchronously because there's no callback function. And yet all of our expects are just working on the value it sets. I think that might come back to bite us at some point, but I don't know. Anyway, that fixes the problem. So now we've got our class rendering. Now what I'm going to do is refactor this to not depend on the amount, but instead do our funky little render to approach. Okay, I've got this funky little render target. And again, this render target is a deliberate attempt to go outside of the kind of architecture most frameworks want. It's very wonky. It's not really even good style. The idea here, though, is that you can ask a value object to render itself to a target, and the target will handle the details of how the UI layer works, but the value object will understand what kinds of things to actually render and what the rules are for rendering different types of information. So the value object knows if something is negative, the UI layer is responsible for determining how to display something that is negative. So here we are creating a render target and then getting the value, the dollars object, telling it to render itself to that render target. And then I've set up a method called isNegative that will return whether or not this value is negative. Now it's kind of screwy. And run it. I'm not even sure if it will work, but let's go ahead and try it. Okay, this appears to be working. Now it's really weird. Ember has this sort of declarative approach where it wants to declare its values and then have them string together via these computed properties. So really, rather than having negative re-render every time, what I should do is have it depend on the rendered value and then add a rendered value computed property that will in turn depend on value. And the reason I'm doing this is because when the value changes, we want the rendered value to update and the negative property go through. But when it doesn't change, we want to take advantage of Ember's internal caching to not rerun this code. Now, I don't normally worry about performance until we have a proven need, but I am trying to be idiomatic. I'm trying to do this in the Ember way. So I should be able to take this, render to that, and then return the render target to get our rendered value. And then here, I'll say this.get rendered value and look at the isNegative function. Will that work? I'm not sure. Yeah, it appears to. Okay, I've cleaned up the test a little bit. The next thing I want to do is get that invalid marker in there. So when we run our Java app and we put an invalid value in, it shows up with this warning icon here. And the way that's supposed to be implemented is with an image tag, specifically this one. Now, I think the Ember way of doing this would be to have an if statement in the handlebars template. So what I should do is say something like, if invalid, we do this. Otherwise, we do this. So that's what we want to do. Now, before I do that, let me actually put this all back because, of course, I want to test drive it. So what we want to say is that it renders invalid values with a invalid icon. And we'll create an invalid dollars object and expect that to equal our image source tag. That should fail. Right now we're just getting $question, question, question. That's the default text value. But now I'm going to go into our cell and put in the appropriate handlebars text. And then in the cell, let's go ahead and set up this invalid function. It's going to be a computed property. And that might just work. And it almost did, except that we got a bunch of white space that we weren't expecting. So let me see if I can trim it. Okay, got it. It was just a matter of putting the trim function in every single test. Okay, well, this has been pretty painless, and I actually feel like it's not too ugly. I mean, as of all the frameworks I've looked at, in a way, this code is it's definitely cleaner than Angular's way of dealing with our wacky render target stuff. And it's actually maybe even a little bit nicer than React, although React did have a pretty nice implementation of it. I'm going to go and finish this off. I need a proper text property. Right now it's just rendering the value, but we're supposed to go off of the rendered targets text property rather than just calling toString. And also we need a title attribute. I think that the attribute may be the tricky part here, but I think it's going to be pretty much the same as class name bindings. Well, I'm definitely liking this code. There's a little bit more I want to do though. These dot properties seem very error prone. And so I want to see what happens if we leave one out. Will the code still pass its tests? No, it does not, because it doesn't see the changes. Well, that's good. And if I misspell something here, will it pass its tests? No. Oh, excellent, 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 excellent. So that is working pretty perfectly, and it's not even error prone, as long as the tests are written properly. So this is great. It's a bit verbose, and there may be a way of making it less verbose, but I don't think there is. But overall, in terms of cleanliness, this is really nice. And I like the declarative nature of it. I like the way our template came out, really nice here. Overall, just I'm very, very happy with this code. I have found Ember to be frustrating in terms of, learning how to make everything work. But now that we've got it working, it's pretty nice. I'm definitely happy with this. Okay, there we go. Mocked up data is in place. We've got our negative value, or invalid value, with tooltips. We've got our negative values with their negative class. It looks great. It's really fantastic. Implementing this was just a matter of, in our stock market row, setting up some dummy hard-coded data and then modifying our HTML bars template to point to those parameters. Looking really good here. And one thing that I've found interesting is that I chose this particular architecture here, specifically because it's wacky. It's kind of silly. And I expected the frameworks to really struggle with it, but although Ember has been extremely opinionated about tooling, and that's been very frustrating, the actual architecture of the application, it didn't care. It just wanted me to be declarative, but that was really not a problem to work with. We just had to create this intermediate property. Overall, I'm finding Ember much more friendly to work with than, say, Angular, which was actually more, I had to struggle with a lot more in order to get it to work with my system. This Ember is pretty straightforward here. So nice job. The next thing to do is to get the stock market row to use real data to actually hook up to our domain model, which has a stock market projection in it, which consists of a bunch of stock market years. Each stock market row should represent a single stock market year. It's really nothing more than mapping a stock market year to the appropriate parameters. The hard part with this tends to be in the testing, because now we have to test that nested components are working properly. I'm going to go ahead and get started on that and see how it turns out. Okay, I have our stock market year, or our stock market row test in place here. What we're doing is we're setting up a stock market year. That's our domain object, and doing our boilerplate, setting it into the value, and then testing to see that that is set on all the appropriate parts of the stock market row. What's happening here is that we've got our row is nothing more than a bunch of cells that are mapped to various values, and those values are just pulled right out of that stock market year with a little bit of special logic in a couple of places. So the test to do that is not that valuable, actually. There's not any logic here, so we're really just reproducing the code that is in our production code. That's not great. We do have this other test to make sure that that the cells change when the value changes. Again, not a lot of value there. The thing that we're not doing yet, though, that I want to be able to do, if for no other reason to prove that we can do it, is none of this is being tested. So if I change this to Yixer, or rather, if I change this to starting balance, I don't believe our test will fail, because nothing is checking that we're actually rendering the right thing. And starting balance is a valid field name. So yeah, it just renders no problem, but it produces the wrong results. So what I would like is the ability to say something like expect component, row 0 to equal the rendered version of stock market sell. I don't know how to do that in Ember. It's actually not been really easy to do in any of the frameworks we've tried, but I'm particularly not sure how to do it with Ember because Ember adds a lot of markup to our cells or to anything that it renders. I'm going to go ahead and give it a try and see what happens, but we may just have to be satisfied with setting these values and not actually checking the markup itself. And in this case, that's not really necessary, but if we had more logic in here and we were doing something a little more sophisticated like we are with our cell markup, then we'd want to check those branches. And I just don't see how to do it when you've got another component inside your component. Okay, this is weird. I was seeing some really weird results as I was poking around into this. I was just trying to render out one of the stock market cells, and it wasn't working the way I wanted to, and it wasn't working. So I just decided to render out the entire row. And very strangely, what I'm getting when I do this is, well, let me just show you. I'm getting all of the table data cells, but there's nothing inside them. It's as if the stock market cell template isn't running at all, and the component isn't running at all. And I'm wondering if there's some sort of weird automagic test double creation happening here where it sees that we are depending on stock market cell, and rather than actually using the stock market cell, it's being nice and stubbing it out for us. I don't know. There's something else really weird going on here too. If I inject their test helpers, which allows us to do things like click buttons and press keys and so forth, I added that on the off chance that maybe things were happening asynchronously and I wasn't aware of it. The way I actually don't think this is the right thing to do here, but when you use one of their asynchronous helpers, what you have to do is call and then at the end. And I added that in, and when I tried to do that, well, you see a problem with their opinionated tooling once again. It's complaining that QUnit isn't defined. That's not so good. I just thought I'd show that to you because it's another example of how if you don't use exactly the tools that Ember wants you to use, you're in trouble. Anyway, I don't know what's going on here with this no stock market sell happening. I'm just going to keep on digging into it. We'll see where it takes us. Okay, I have spent a couple of hours at this point, and I am no closer to a solution than I was when I started. As best I can tell, this needs parameter that we're passing in to describe component, which is not particularly well documented, this is stubbing out stock market sell. Rather than looking it up, it's actually just stubbing it out. So that means there's no way to test subcomponent rendering. Now, we don't really want to test subcomponent rendering, but because there's also no way of testing components in isolation, as far as I can tell, that means there's no way of testing this component's rendering either. So all we can do is just test the values, these things right here, which is what I have done. So I'm going to just stop there and give up. I don't think there's any way we can really thoroughly test the template aspect of this, which is a problem when you have more sophisticated templates. Maybe there's something I'm missing, but the documentation, once you get off the main path, the documentation is a maze of twisty little paths, all different. It's not fun. And not only that, tools are scattered all throughout the internet. They're not just on the Ember site. The Ember Mocha tool I'm using is on Switchfly's GitHub. It's very frustrating, and I am giving up. This is completely defeated me. But on the positive side, I do have this rendering a single row. So the one last thing I want to do that's left is test drive stock market table, make sure that it's actually rendering out all the rows. I don't know if we can test drive that since we can't actually test the components in any way, but I'm going to go ahead and see what I can see. And when I'm done, we should have a complete table set up here, but it won't be interactive yet. Okay, we have got this all rendered. I have hard coded a basic domain projection and have that filtering through our table, our rows, and the individual cells. And of course, the cells are rendering negative and invalid values correctly. It's all working. Now, I did run into the problem, as expected, with the table that in our stock market table handlebars template, we are doing this each handlebars logic. And then inside of that loop, we are rendering out a stock market row template. There is no way to test that this stock market row is being rendered with the correct value. So I just had to punt on that. What I'm doing instead is this is based on the year's value or property, which I'm defining here. So what I'm doing in my test is getting that year's property out and making assertions about that. And then I do verify that TR tag, that I know each row is a TR. So I check to make sure that we have the correct number of those. So we're sort of testing that for each, but not really. So the main constraint here is that when you have a component inside of a component, you cannot test that it is being rendered with the correct properties. It will render it with no content. So you can check to see that there's a div or a TD or a TR or whatever, but you can't check to see that it's the right one. So that is the main restriction here. Now on the positive side, it does stub out subcomponents that we aren't concerned with in our unit test, but it doesn't replace it with any way of saying, hey, we got the right component. If I could just say that there are 41 of these components without caring what the component looked like, it would be perfect, but it doesn't do that. So it's a bit weak, but it's not as bad as I was feeling earlier when I was really frustrated about spending, a couple of hours trying to figure out what was going on. Now that I understand that it's just basically stubbing out any subcomponents, you can work with that by just looking at the properties on the component, which is what I ended up doing. And that is it for our component rendering and connecting to our domain layer. Overall, it was pretty clean. I'm really happy in particular with the way the cell rendering ended up working. It is kind of verbose, and there may be a way of factoring this out to be less verbose, but because it depends on this, I don't know that the factored out approach would actually be much better. There's also some duplication in that whenever you get a property, you also have to say that you're depending on that property, which is a little annoying. However, when I'd made deliberate spelling mistakes, those errors were caught by the test. Now, you do have to make sure that if you want those errors to be caught, you have to update the cell and verify that it is changing. So it's a little bit clunky there. The testing of components is fantastic. The testing of subcomponents, as we've discussed, is a little less fantastic. But being able to check that it had my class and title and that the correct HTML was being put in for the lowest level component that was doing the bulk of the work, that came out really well. And that does it for this episode. Next time, we are going to continue on by looking at interactivity. We're going to look at what it takes to enter form fields, cross-application communication, and some other issues that might come up along the way. Thanks very much for watching, everybody, and I will catch you next time.